Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University and the Director of the George Southern Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And today I'm steps away from the Visitor Center at Monocacy Battlefield, and though we were only about a mile south of Frederick, we are kind of immersed in this absolutely beautiful countryside. And today we're going to be going through this arena under the guidance and care of a good friend of the center, a published author of some renown, a seminar participant for us, and most importantly, for our purposes today, a ranger here at Monocacy. And this, of course, is Matt Borders. Matt, again, is an expert on this field, but also very knowledgeable about the Maryland campaign, about which he published. And Matt's going to be taking us through a variety of different stops today, and we hope it's going to give you an overview of the 1864 campaign and some exposure to the experiences of both soldiers and civilians on this battlefield. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to provide an overview of the campaign to set the stage for us. And so with that, Matt, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
It's a pleasure to be with you guys this morning. My name is Matt Borders. I'm ranger here with Monocacy National Battlefield. And what we're going to be doing is talking about the last full year of the war, 1864. As you guys know, this is a huge year in Civil War history. Ulysses S. Grant has been brought from the Western Theater to the east to command all Union forces, and he has told his commanders across the board that spring to go, to push the Confederates to the breaking point wherever they can be found. We would have offenses in the Western Theater, in Louisiana, the Trans-Mississippi, and in Virginia alone, we will have 3 separate Union armies operating. The Army of the James under Benjamin Butler on the James River, the Army of West Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, and of course, the Army of the Potomac, with which Grant will make his headquarters on the Rapidan River. Now, Grant's advance is going to lead to a series of engagements known as the Overland Campaign. And the Overland Campaign will push Confederate forces southward towards their capital at Richmond and Petersburg, Petersburg being its primary supply depot. This series of bloody engagements, while it will succeed in driving Robert E. Lee and his vaunted Army of Northern Virginia back towards its capital and into its defenses, it will cost the Union dearly. Approximately 40,000 casualties in about 40 days. Grant wants to keep on the pressure. He wants to keep up these efforts against Lee, and to do that, he will need more men. To reinforce his armies, he is going to begin pulling troops from the defenses of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the most heavily fortified city on earth at this point, with 84 fortifications and 96 batteries or separate gun positions surrounding the national capital. Thousands of men, many of them being cross-trained as heavy artillery regiments. So they will be using the big guns of the forts, but also can utilize small arms. And that's what Grant's going to use them for, as infantry. Those soldiers will be pulled from the northern ring of fortifications, those forts that are above the Potomac River, because why not? The fighting's all to the south. It's now getting around Richmond and Petersburg. That is the safest place to pull troops from, at least according to the federal government. However, as we have had these movements towards Richmond and Petersburg in Virginia, we've also had, still in Virginia, but out in the Shenandoah Valley, further federal movements. David Hunter's forces have been making their way through the Shenandoah Valley, destroying Confederate infrastructure as it goes, particularly railroads and telegraph lines that will of course burn VMI when it's in Lexington, and it's making its way towards Lynchburg. Any idea why? It's a railroad crossroad. Specifically, it's helping to feed Lee's army here around Richmond and Petersburg, and if Lynchburg is cut off, that's a major supply route that has now been severed to Lee's forces. He cannot allow this to happen, and so he is going to begin sending Confederates out to Lynchburg to aid in the defense of that city. There were already some Confederate forces there, but Lee is going to send this gentleman, Lieutenant General Jubal Anderson Early. Around June 12, 1864, Early is going to begin his movements out towards Lynchburg, and this movement will be done as a mix of marching and by rail. Between Charlottesville and Lynchburg, he would be able to move his forces primarily by rail. They will reach Lynchburg beginning on June 17th. Now, the Confederate forces that were already there, they're actually commanded by a former Vice President of the United States, John C. Breckinridge. With Early and Breckinridge together on the 17th and 18th of June, we're going to have in the neighborhood of 14,000 to 18,000 Confederates. The number's a little fluid depending on who you read. David Hunter's forces have approximately the same amount of men. But Early here is going to trick his opponent. He's going to trick Hunter. He's brought his men in by train for this last leg of the journey, but he's going to send that train away and then have it come back into Lynchburg. And every time it comes back into the city, it doesn't have more men on it, but the bands will play, the people will cheer, and they're going to keep this up all night. What do you think that sounds like to Hunter and his men just beyond the lines there at Lynchburg? Reinforcements, and lots of them. David Hunter would begin tapping out messages by telegraph to the War Department. I think half of Lee's army is now in my front. I think Lee's entire army has decamped and is now in my front. And after aggressive motions and attacks by Confederate forces on the 18th, Hunter will be convinced that he is now heavily outnumbered. And that night would begin the retreat back towards Salem in the southern end of the Shenandoah Valley. There would be a pursuit by Confederate forces. They will actually drive Hunter entirely from the valley by the 20th of June, at which point Early has been told that if he can clear the valley as he's just done, he should proceed north, heading for the Potomac River, moving into Maryland, and threatening Washington, D.C. That's going to be the beginnings of what we now know as the Third Confederate Invasion of the North. Now, Early's forces, they will move down the valley or northward 200 miles from the area of Salem up to Harper's Ferry over the course of 2 weeks. About 200 miles, 100 miles a week. That's some heavy marching, hard marching. And this is, of course, in the midst of a Virginia and soon to be Maryland summer. They will reach the outskirts of Harper's Ferry on July 4th, 1864, Independence Day. The Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, though they'd been getting some inkling of the approaching Confederates, for the most part, they weren't prepping for a battle, they were prepping for a party. It's Independence Day. There was food laid out in the streets of Harper's Ferry for the Union garrison. And with the approaching Confederates, that garrison, those Federal soldiers, instead of trying to defend the town as they had tried to do in 1862, will instead fall back to the heights above the city. Now, Early and the Federal defenders at Harper's Ferry would glare at each other for about a day as they're trying to figure out what to do. Early later writing that he would have loved to have captured the garrison, but he knew he didn't have the time. While this is going on, Early's soldiers are ransacking Harper's Ferry. They're going through, they're gobbling up that food that had been left. They're getting supplies from the Union supply depots there. And on the 5th and 6th, Jubal Early would begin to shift his forces north a little further to your guys' town of Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where he will cross the Potomac on the night of the 5th and the 6th of July, 1864. Maryland is now invaded for the third summer in a row. When Confederate forces get into Maryland, we are going to see a series of ransoms being levied upon the towns. Hagerstown, Maryland, on July 6th, would be ransomed for $20,000. Confederate cavalry make those demands and would actually receive the money when 3 banks get together to provide the funds. Early's infantry had continued moving eastward while that had happened, and he would reach Middletown, Maryland, just to the west of Frederick, on the 7th of July, where he would demand $5,000 of Middletown. Now, Middletown, Maryland, is a small town today, as you guys are probably aware. It was even smaller in 1864, and the problem was there wasn't $5,000 in the bank. There's about $1,500, and Early's going to take that in hopes of maybe bringing in the rest of the funds from the surrounding countryside. But fighting broke out here west of Frederick, Maryland on the 7th and 8th, which forces Early to move on. So Middletown got away with only paying that smaller amount. Now the reason that we've had fighting here to the west of town is actually because of this man, Major General Lew Wallace. He will command Union forces here at the Battle of Monocacy, and he has been warned of the approaching Confederates. Come to find out, it wasn't the War Department or the United States military that had really gotten the word or the warning out about these approaching Confederates. It was civilians, telegraph operators on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, tapping out messages to Washington. There's Confederates out here. There's a lot of Confederates out here. We need some help. Those initial calls for aid in the days leading up to and through the 4th of July were ignored. Federal forces, the War Department in particular, believing that all the action was down around Richmond and Petersburg, that it was just cavalry raiders, perhaps John Mosby causing problems along the B&O. And those telegraph operators were told that if they really have an issue, they need to talk to David Hunter, not realizing, the War Department not realizing that Hunter has been pushed out of the picture. It would take the intervention of a civilian, the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, John Garrett, to begin to dig up some help. He's actually going to take a personal train out to Washington and later to later to Baltimore to find some help. And he would find that help in the shape of General Wallace. Now, Wallace has been on a back burner command for about 2 years now, the Middle Department, based out of Baltimore. He's got about 3,300 men under his command, mostly 100 days troops and militia. These are not the frontline soldiers of the Army of the Potomac, not by far. But Wallace sees an opportunity to not only do his duty, but to get back into this war. And so he is going to bring his men out here to Monocacy Junction on July 6th, and then begins moving them up the Frederick Spur, just beyond our parking area here, into downtown Frederick on the 7th. His forces will meet the advancing Confederate columns coming over Catoctin Mountain on July 7th. And in fact, that evening, Wallace here will telegraph to Washington, D.C. about how well his men did, stating, "I think I've just had the best little fight of the war," knocking back those first Confederate probes. But on July 8th, as more Confederates are pushing through the Catoctin Mountain passes, General Wallace recognizes that he will not be able to hold the city, and he is going to fall back beyond the Monocacy River to the high ground in the distance that we're going to get a chance to look at as we go through the battlefield today. Fortunately for General Wallace, the wheels of the War Department have slowly begun to turn. Grant has been notified of a credible threat to Washington, D.C., and he's begun to shift forces north by steamship. This had actually been part of the Confederate plan. The hope was that by threatening Washington, it would force Grant to break off his siege of Richmond and Petersburg and send his forces back north. That is happening. But unbeknownst to the Confederates, Grant and his forces around Richmond and Petersburg have enough strength to not only maintain their hold on Richmond, but also send troops back north. Those veteran soldiers would reach Baltimore and then be shipped out here to Monocacy Junction by train on July 8th and into the early morning hours of July 9th. They are under the command of this gentleman, Brigadier General James Ricketts. This is the 3rd Division, 6th Union Corps, veteran troops from the Army of the Potomac. These men will bump Wallace's strength up to about 6,600 men and 7 cannon. The Confederates that are now moving into Frederick, Maryland, and are looking to push beyond have between 12 and 15,000 soldiers and 38 cannon. A big difference here at Monocacy in both manpower and firepower. So let's get out onto the field and we'll start looking at this fight and the effects that this battle has on the local populace and the farms here.